Welcome to this, our fourth series in the Anglican tradition. The first three series we've looked at various elements of the Anglican tradition, including the English tradition, and then in the third series we dealt with the Canadian outworking of that tradition. In this, the fourth series, we're going to look at the significant role of Erasmus and the Anglican tradition. When most people think of the Anglican heritage or the Church of England, they very rarely connect Erasmus to that particular history of the 16th century. I should mention by beginning is that there are many reformations in the Church, and often the Church is divided in the West to the Roman Catholic and various forms of Protestantism, and then in the East into the Orthodox way. When we think of the English Reformation, there have been many reformations going anywhere from the 2nd century right up to and continue our particular period in history. But the 16th century tends to be focused on more than any other period of Western history, because at that period of time the West reached a crossroads. A great cleavage erupted in the West, and out of that emerged the Protestant heritage, the Lutheran, the Reformed, the Anabaptist, and various sectarian movements that emerged from there, and then the re-entrenchment of the Roman Catholic heritage. And as I have mentioned in earlier series, the Anglican tradition tried to find a middle way, or a via media, between the Roman Catholic tradition on the one hand and the Protestant on the other. So the Anglican way remains thoroughly Catholic, but not Roman, thoroughly Reformed, but not schismatic. Now, when we think of the Reformation of the 16th century, and as I mentioned, there are many reformations within the Church of England, within Anglicanism, as there are in other denominations and in the Mother Church tradition. But we tend to focus on the 16th century for the simple reason of the implications of it for the West. Then when we go on to think of the English Reformation, most people, when they ponder it, they'll consider people like Latimer, Ridley, Cranmer. They'll think of the work of John Jewel and Richard Hooker, who is seen as sort of the crown prince of the sort of summarizing of the Elizabethan heritage. Most don't consider, though, that before Latimer, Ridley, before Cranmer, before Jewel, before Hooker, there was already a lively Reformation going on in England at the time. And some of the people that were central to that were those called the Oxford movement, or the London Reformers, or the Oxford Reformers. By the 1490s, John Colet, one of the leading English thinkers, had gone to Italy, and out of Italy was emerging a renaissance of thought. A great turn was being made to the Bible and particular ways of interpreting the Bible. John Colet came back to England, and in his turn to England, he began to do lectures at Oxford, particularly on the writings of St. Paul. Paul's pastoral writings, Paul's letters, Paul's more theological texts. And there was quite a turnout at Oxford to hear John Colet's lectures at the time. John Colet went on to become the Dean of St. Paul's. Because of Colet's significance in terms of England, there emerged a young man, very gifted, who had done his work in the classics, knew his Greek thinkers, knew the Latin tradition well, was feeling his way within the biblical tradition, what we would consider a highly gifted person, but not quite sure of where to go with his giftedness. Very learned person by tendency and by temperament, but not knowing quite how to use those gifts. His name was Erasmus. Erasmus's first trip to England was in 1499. He was brought over by Lord Montjoy, who he was a tutor to when Montjoy was in Paris. And it's in Erasmus's meetings with John Colet at Oxford that Colet keyed in on Erasmus, and he noted very, very carefully that this was a person who had immense potential. And he pointed out to Erasmus, with his gifts, with his abilities, what he could do if he was more disciplined and focused and directed his studies in a more meaningful public manner. And so Erasmus became, by 1499, a part of that broader a growing number of leading thinkers in England who are also activists and wanting to reform the church. Remembering this is long before Luther comes along, much longer before Calvin or the Anabaptists come along. And so Erasmus, in his first visit to England then in 1499, is taken into and welcomed into the fold of the Oxford Reformers. Erasmus then returned to England once again in 1505 and was welcomed into the company of people like Sir Thomas More and many of the leading bishops, the Archbishop of Canterbury at the time, and they recognized in Erasmus' second visit that this was a person who could contribute a great deal to the reformation of the Church of England. Erasmus was then welcomed back in a much longer stay from 1509 to 1514. And it's fascinating at this particular period of time that Erasmus is doing all of his new work on the translations of the New Testament and revising Jerome's Vulgate. Out of this time from 1509 to 1514 in England, Erasmus does the main work on his first translation of the Bible that came out in 1516. It was this particular translation of the Bible that challenged Jerome's Vulgate and gave a whole range of alternate interpretations that was to have an impact on Luther's 1517 Wittenberg, the 95 Theses, and his attack on indulgences. Erasmus again came to England in 1517 and played once again a significant role in challenging, increasingly so, Henry VIII's increasing warlike tendencies. So Erasmus was a part of what we would call the Oxford Reformers. He was playing a pivotal role in England in reforming the church long before Luther came along, and it was his work in translating the Bible that had quite an impact on Luther and where Luther was going in the future and the Lutheran Reformation on the continent. I'll move into the next part of this series in section 2 and looking at how Erasmus's translation, particularly of a section in Acts, had quite an impact on what the Reformation was become, and hence how England played probably one of the most significant roles in the Reformation of both the continent and England itself.